Hi, my name is Tyler Shaw. I am second year faculty here in the HVAC program at George Mason University in the psychology department. I hail from the University of Cincinnati where I did my graduate work. I came out in 2008 to do a postdoc in the department, and in 2010 I took a tenure line faculty position and have been doing that ever since. This is Raul Ramirez and Kelly Satterfield. They are graduate students, PhD candidates, who have joined me this year. I'm very excited to have them. They're doing excellent work, which I'll describe to you in some detail. So what we have here is a device called transcranial Doppler sonography. I know it's a mouthful, but it's basically an ultrasound technique that we use to monitor blood flow velocity in one of the main stem intracranial arteries. So it's based on the logic that as you're performing any kind of mental task, there's a buildup of carbon dioxide. Of course, your brain doesn't like carbon dioxide, so there's a frequency shift in the amount of oxygenated blood that's delivered to the brain to remove that waste product, right? So presumably, as you're pushing your brain harder, you should actually see higher levels of blood flow velocity, the speed at which blood actually flows to the brain. So what Kelly is demonstrating here is the actual hookup of the procedure. And you can see that all it requires is just a simple configuration of the headset that's equipped with two transducer probes. These probes, as Kelly is holding in her hand, act as both the sender and receiver of the Doppler ultrasound signal. So it transmits a very high frequency sound wave and bounces back. And it's based on fast Fourier transformations that calculate the angles at which so essentially we can determine how fast blood is moving by the width of the actual angles, right? So it's also been called the poor man's fMRI. And the reason it's called that is because, like fMRI, we are investigating cerebral hemodynamics, right? Whereas fMRI would use the bold contrast, what we're using here is just sort of a simpler Doppler paradigm. So whereas with fMRI, you get very, very fancy images and different areas of the brain are actually lighting up, and you can actually see that in the images that are subsequently analyzed. Here, we don't have those pretty images, but we do have a pretty nice looking display that gives us information about lateralization of function, not necessarily localization of function, so I can't tell you what's going on in specific brain regions, but lateralization of function, because the two hemispheres in the brain do have very distinct functions. So the reason we use this procedure in our research is because we're looking for neurophysiological indices of cognitive workload. So we're operating under the assumption that in everybody's brain there is a limited amount of information that you can actually process. And we are trying to essentially determine those limits and to see how that translates into operational settings, right? For example, it may seem as if a baggage inspector has this very seemingly simple job of just looking for information critical blips on a screen for a very extended period of time. But research from our lab and from research that I've done at University of Cincinnati, it's been shown that it is in fact a very taxing job, and it requires a lot of what's called cognitive resources. So the logic is, just as you drive your car harder and faster, just like you drive your brain harder and faster, you're essentially going to burn up more gas. Another thing that's important, another assumption that we operate under, is that cognitive resources are actually finite. You only have so many in your head. So just like you occasionally have to stop and fill your car up with gas, you occasionally have to stop and fill your brain up with gas through RECs or other kind of sort of resurging activities. So the studies that we run in my lab are called vigilance studies or sustained attention studies. Basically what we do is we sit somebody in front of a computer screen for an extended period of time, and we have them respond to critical signals that occur very infrequently and very unpredictably. And you do this continuously for up to 40 to 60 minutes. It's a very, very boring task, right? So, of course, one could argue that people are just withdrawing effort from the task because, in fact, it's so boring. But what we've shown continuously is that people are unable to sustain the amount of performance throughout the duration of the task, right? So we're operating under the resource theory, which suggests that you have so many resources in the beginning, but with continuous task performance, you're actually going to drain those resources, right? So what we often find in vigilance is called the vigilance decrement, or the decline in performance over time. So people are doing much worse at the end of the task than they are at the beginning. And again, one could explain these findings through boredom, but boredom is really doesn't really make testable predictions, right? So the theory that does make the testable predictions is resource theory. But of course, everybody wants to know what's a resource. And of course, we're operating under the current paradigm of psychology, neuroscience. And everybody wants to know the brain mechanisms that underlie resource depletion. So to answer those questions, we turn to this technique, transcranial Doppler sonography, or TCD for short. And what we've found consistently is that the vigilance decrement, or this decline in performance over time, is generally paralleled by a decline in blood flow velocity. In other words, blood is not moving to your brain as fast as it was in the beginning of the task. Something else that we often find is as we increase the difficulty of the task, there is an increase in blood flow velocity as well. So as you're working harder and as your brain is working harder, we're actually able to index these cognitive resources. So the implications for this are pretty far-reaching. Maybe we found the equivalent of a gas gauge in your car for the brain, and we can actually determine how much gas you're burning.